taking you through this auditing session on pre-engagement activities. What are pre-engagement activities? So these are activities or procedures that the auditor is supposed to take before engaging a client for an audit. That is, it could be client acceptance or it could be client continuance. So let's look at our objectives for this session. Firstly, we want to be able to explain the matters that the auditor should consider when deciding to accept or to continue performing an audit for an existing client. Next, after the session, you should be able to evaluate the audit work that has been performed when a client was accepted, and we'll be looking at the guidance that we're supposed to refer to, which is ISQC 1, ISA 220, ISA 300, and the CPC. You should also be able to describe the audit procedures that need to be performed when a new auditor is being appointed by a client. And we also want to be able to understand the purpose of the engagement letter between the auditor and the client. We also have to understand the role of the auditor vis-a-vis the auditor limiting their liability to the audit client. So let's have a bit of a background in terms of pre-engagement activities. So we ask ourselves a fair question or an important question for us to understand the whole background. And that question would be, what decision do we want to make? So the decision that we want to make is whether or not to continue with a client that is an existing client or to accept a client. Every year, before we engage a client, whether it is at the inception of accepting that client or of continuing, the auditor needs to make that decision, whether they want to continue with that client or whether they want to engage that client to be part of their clients. That is whether the auditor wants to do work or to carry out an audit for the client. The next question is, what key issues should be considered at the stage of making the decision of whether or not to accept the client? So the key issues are client investigation. The auditor needs to investigate whether or not they want to engage this client. So client investigation looks internally at the client. We also then have to look internally, that is within the audit firm. Do we have the required or the requisite capabilities? Do we have the skills? Do we have the competences to carry out an audit of this client and therefore be able to express an appropriate audit opinion? And lastly, we want to be able to establish the terms of engagement. And those terms of engagement are detailed in the engagement letter, which is then supposed to be signed by the auditor and the client as a way to show that the terms of engagement have been established, they have been agreed on, and the audit will be carried out. So we'll just look at an overview of the pre-engagement activities. And in a nutshell, or breaking them down, we've got 5 areas that we're supposed to look at. And 4 of those 5 areas are questions that the auditor is supposed to be able to answer before engaging a client. The fifth being agreeing on the terms of engagement, or rather establishing the terms of engagement. So let's look at the 4 questions. And the 4 questions, so the first question is the auditor asking themselves that, are there any statutory reasons why we should not accept this client? So you're asking yourself questions such as, is there a vacancy in the first place? Were we able to contact the predecessor auditor, the predecessor auditor being the previous auditor? If we were able to contact them, did they say that there were no professional reasons why we should not accept this engagement? So this question is only applicable when we are accepting a new client. If we were the auditors last year and it's client continuance, then there is no need for us to worry about contacting the predecessor auditor, because we would be the predecessor auditor. We would only have to then consider that based on previous years, on prior year, are there any professional reasons why we should not continue with this client? The next question would be, are there any ethical concerns or any ethical reasons why we should not accept this client or continue with this client? And in terms of our ethics, we'll then refer to the CPC. If you think back to your CPC lecture, you will then think about the fundamental principles that the auditor or that a CA is supposed to comply with. So our question before accepting an audit client or continuing with an audit client is to say, are there any threats to those fundamental principles? If there are threats that we've identified, can those threats be minimized, or can they be reduced to an acceptable level? That is to say, will we be able to apply appropriate safeguards? The next question would be, are we competent? Do we have the competence and resources to be able to carry out this audit? And if we're looking at competence and resources, we're asking ourselves, for example, does this client, this particular client, rely a lot on IT, that is information technology? And do we have the IT resources to be able to audit this client and express an appropriate audit opinion? Do we need an expert? So for example, we could be auditing a mine, and we ask ourselves, are we able to quantify, to really come up with the value of ore that has been mined, or of reserves that have not yet been mined? That might require an expert. So we're asking ourselves, do we have that expertise? If not, are we able to look for somebody who could be an auditor's expert or even a management's expert, who has the correct capabilities and competencies to value that iron ore, or to value that gold ore, or any other ore, or the reserves, for us to then say, with the work of that expert, we will be able to express an appropriate audit opinion. We also need to consider whether we'll be able to meet the deadlines. What are the timelines of this audit? Do they permit us to express an appropriate audit opinion? Or perhaps are they too tight? And do we need to do anything for us to be able to express an audit opinion that is appropriate? The next question, if we're satisfied that we've got the requisite competences and capabilities, the next question would be, have we investigated the client? Do we want to be engaged with this client? Do we want to be associated with this client as the auditor? And the most important thing that comes up is, what is the client's integrity? Is the client's management people of a good standing? Do they have the integrity? Would we be happy to be associated with such a client? We then also ask ourselves whether the client also or possibly values the function of the external audit or even the internal audit. Does this client value the audit function? We're also asking ourselves, are there any possible or potential litigation or legal liabilities that will arise as a result of engaging this client? If there are any, do we have the appropriate safeguards, or will we be able to implement the appropriate safeguards? If we're satisfied by these 4 questions, remember, satisfaction could come about as a result of implementing safeguards. So if our safeguards can be implemented and minimize any concerns or any worries that we might have before auditing this client, then we then can be able to establish the terms of engagement, which is step number 5. We then can write an engagement letter, and once we've done that, we agree on the terms of engagement with the audit client. However, before we go further, we need to look at the nature of questions that the auditor should, or that are normally examinable. Remember, at the end of the day, we want to be able to answer the questions that will come with regards to pre-engagement activities in the exam. Such questions could be: critically evaluate the client acceptance procedures that have been documented in a particular working paper. So what are you expected to do? You're expected to go through that working paper, understand the procedures that were carried out, evaluate those procedures based on your ISQC 1, ISA 200, data mistake. We want to be able to critically evaluate the client acceptance procedures as documented in a particular working paper. And you as the student, you're supposed to read what is contained in that working paper. And when you've read through that, you ask yourself, based on ISQC 1, ISA 220, ISA 300, and the CPC, have we complied with what we were supposed to do before accepting a client? If there's anything that is outstanding, then possibly we need to write that down. That is what the examiner is expecting you to write. Once evaluating something is saying, has it been done in accordance with the correct standard? So you could be asked to write what are the additional procedures that should have been carried out. You're therefore then looking at what has been done, evaluating it, then considering, are there any additional procedures from your knowledge that should have been carried out? You could also be asked that what are the pre-engagement activities, or what are the procedures that should be carried out before accepting this client? Or you could also be asked the procedures that should have been carried out to accept before accepting this client. And what is key between those 2 questions is the context. The other question is saying the client has already been accepted. So what should have been considered that possibly was not considered? The other question, on the other hand, is saying we have not yet accepted this client. So what are the audit procedures that should be considered before accepting this client? Again, you benchmark with your standards, which is your ISQC 1, your ISA 220, and ISA 300, as well as the CPC. In terms of application of knowledge, I refer you to the end of chapter question. Attempt that question. Are you able to answer it? If you've got any queries or any problems that you might be facing, then refer back to your modules and read through your modules, read through your lecture slides. Remember, this video is not a substitute of any of those. This is the end of this session, and thank you very much for being with me. I look forward to meeting you in the next session.